Good afternoon and evening, all attendees to our October webinar on plants and fish systems. For those of you who have not been to one of our webinars before, the GoToWebinar system is set up with that little sidebar there, and one of those drop-down menus is actually a questions box. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to put them in that box. Unfortunately, on my end, the box is very, very small, so I will do my best to get to all the questions at the end of the webinar. So today, our talk will cover aquatic plant classification, aquatic plant physiology, common interactions of fish and plants, and common plant questions, which is going to be most of where we land today. Now, starting off with plants and fish systems, we always get the first question is, can fish and plants be in the same system? And you can absolutely have plants and fish in the same system. There are some koi purists who say, oh no, you can't have any plants in there with the fish, but there is absolutely no reason why other than simple aesthetic preference. So starting off, yes, you can have fish and plants in the same aquatic system. So first, we're going to go through a little bit of the different aquatic plant classifications, because there are a few discrepancies between the different types of plants that go well with water. All aquatic plants are called macrophytes, and they may be emergent, which is a partially submerged plant. These are going to be around, say, the periphery of your pond that, still will probably be in the mud, and you can commonly have these at reeds, cattails, and rice, and those big elephant ears, which I have a couple clients who love. Floating macrophytes will have roots attached to the substrate, but the leaves at the surface, and a great example of this are lilies. And then you have your, and there's a good example of a different type of floating plant, and you can see the branches coming down there of the roots. And then you have the submerged plants, which are completely underwater. An example of this is the nubius. And these are more common in aquatic aquariums rather than in ponds. So there are many different morphologies of aquatic plants. I don't have time to really go through them all, but here's kind of a little example of all the different morphologies you can possibly have in aquatic plants. Basically, they vary by where their roots are, where their leaves are, either if they're at the surface or above the surface, or if they're not attached to anything at all. So all of these different morphologies can be found in various aquatic plants. Now, what about saltwater plants? Well, they actually aren't plants at all. All plants, I'm doing that in quotes, but you can't see me, found in saltwater are actually algae. And these are made up of colonial microorganisms. You can see the big kelp there, very common in the Pacific Ocean. This is made up of billions of tiny little organisms. And this lovely giant forest kelp can actually grow up to a foot a day with the right conditions. So they may look a lot like plants, but they're not at all plants. Going on to aquatic plant physiology. How do you take something that usually lives in dirt and stick it underwater? Well, their physiology is actually very, very similar to land plants. Their roots are responsible for taking up nutrients to feed the stems, the leaves, and the flowers. So again, they might have roots that are set into substrate, and they might have roots that are floating in the aquatic environment. So depending on their morphology will kind of depend on where they get their nutrients from. Is it from the surrounding soil and substrate, or is it from the water themselves? So just as in land plants, these plants are going to uptake water-based nutrients. Now, some of the most common ones found in aquatic systems are going to be your nitrates, the end of your nitrogen cycle, and your phosphates. So looking a little bit more, hopefully you are all very, very familiar with our lovely nitrogen cycle. Basically, a fish is going to produce ammonia. And yes, I know this is a clownfish in a pond. They don't do that. They like salt water. But unfortunately, I didn't have any good koi pictures. So the fish will produce ammonia, which is then converted into nitrite, And then finally, nitrate. And the nitrate is taken up by aquatic plants or removed from the system entirely during a water change. This is where most plants will get their nutrition is from the waste produced by fish and other plants. As they die, they're going to re-release the nitrates, ammonia back into the system. So this is a lot of where those nutrients come from. But what about phosphate? Well, phosphate is actually added to some fish foods, actually almost all of them. And excess feeding and extra food lying around is one of the most common sources for phosphate in the aquatic environment. It can also be a common element in source water. Depending on where you live, you may or may not have a lot of phosphates just coming in with whatever source water you use for your system. Now, phosphate is actually used in marine tanks to grow corals. So again, not plants, but they are a collection of little microorganisms that use those phosphates to build little shells. So that's where the phosphate will actually be in most of those salt mixes for marine tanks that are used to grow corals. So now everybody think back to your high school chemistry and biology classes and try to remember photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is required for plant growth. And depending on how deep a plant is in the system may restrict some of the growth due to sunlight penetration. So you see our lovely example there of the lovely algae bogs only a few inches below the surface. If they were deeper, there might not be as much sunlight. So this is broken into different zones. So the top zone is actually going to be able to have parts of plants above the surface. And again, we're thinking of our lilies, our cattails, anything that's either going to be at the surface or above the surface. And this is going to be about up to 6 feet high. The middle zone, again, can be anywhere between 6 and 10 feet. And then the bottom zone, again, these plants are usually completely submerged at 10 feet or deeper. I understand many of your fish systems will not get this deep. So again, most of the aquatic plants we'll be talking about today can fit in that top zone. Now keep in mind that the deeper the plant is, the more that water turbidity can actually affect plant growth by blocking photosynthesis, basically keeping the plants from getting enough sunlight in order to grow. So certainly if you're having lots of issue with cloudy water, if you're having an algae bloom, again, it's going to deter the light from getting all the way to the plants that you actually want at the bottom of your system. And now, how does photosynthesis work? Well, using sunlight, plants will take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and turn it into oxygen and water. Yes, all plants are amazing creatures that during the day, everything out there you see outside that's green is photosynthesizing and taking carbon dioxide and turning it into oxygen, which is great because fish, even though they live in an aquatic environment, still need lots of oxygen. However, what happens at nighttime when the sun's not out? Well, even though the sun's not out, the fish are still, or excuse me, the plants are still going to be respirating. And that's what most animals do, is we take oxygen, water, and convert it into CO2. And this is what plants do, just as well as producing all of those lovely, oxygen themselves. They use it as well. It's just the way that cells work. They need oxygen in order to function correctly. And these plants at nighttime will give off carbon dioxide into the air and into the water, in addition to sucking out some of the oxygen. This increase in CO2 causes acidification of the water. So again, we're throwing out a lot of those hydrogen ions. Now, if you have a system that, again, gets more acids from these plants, as long as you have buffers in there, your pH will remain stable. However, if you do not have any buffers, your KH is very, very low, this could result in a decreasing pH. So it's very important that if you do have a system that has plants in it, that you make sure your KH is high enough to allow these plants to respirate overnight. So again, I know this is a little bit of a tricky concept sometime to wrap your head around. So during the day, plants are using photosynthesis to make oxygen. However, since they are a living organism, they are also using oxygen in their cells to live. So part of what they make, they use up themselves. However, when it's nighttime, photosynthesis is not working. So the plants are just respiring, just like you and I, taking in oxygen, breathing out carbon dioxide. And this will go into the water and some into the air. And they're also going to be using the oxygen in the water. So buffers will keep your pH stable with this additional acidification. A low pH, low KH could potentially swing your pH low. And this is why if you've ever tested your water various times during the day, you will most likely get a pH lower in the morning than in the evening. And this is also true if you have a lot of algae in your pond. Algae, again, very simplified plant, but not a plant, microorganism. We'll get to that in a minute. Also, having a lot of plants and algae can cause fish to asphyxiate if there is no additional oxygen overnight. We have many clients who will actually turn off their waterfalls during the night because, you know, it's loud. I get that. Some of them have pretty bad leaks. But unfortunately, if you don't, say, have an aerator or any other way for oxygen to get into the water, you have a lot of plants, a lot of algae, they could potentially outcompete your fish for oxygen and cause them to asphyxiate just simply from the sun going down. And this obviously is not good. So that covers everything from the physiological side of things. Hopefully I've made it simple enough. If not, feel free to ask questions later. So now we're going to go through some of the interactions between plants and fish. One of the great things plants can provide are hiding spots. So especially if you have an indoor aquarium and you have, say, some fish that don't get along well with their neighbors, or they just prefer to have some place to hide, it gives them a great opportunity to get in there. Everything is nice and soft. Again, if you have fish that have very long or delicate fins, you have to make sure that your decor is going to be soft, and many of these aquarium plants are nice and soft. And especially if you have an outdoor pond, this is great predator deterrent because they won't be able to see the fish under the leaves. However, some crazy raccoons may try to skip across your leaves in your pond. You'll come out one morning and everything will be torn to shreds. That is usually an indication something tried to walk through your pond, especially on those giant lily pads, and didn't have the greatest time. So try to keep those away from the edges so the raccoons don't use them as a platform. Decreased sun exposure. Yes, outdoor fish can get sunburned. The skin cancer hikui has not officially been linked to any sort of UV exposure. However, as you know, in humans, increased UV exposure obviously has an increase for skin cancer. So here we have lovely little float that's providing some shade for this guy here. His little friend is up there checking out the water hyacinths to see what's going on. But yes, having this will also help regulate the temperature of your pond if it is very shallow, because again, you won't have as much sun coming to kind of cook everything really quickly. And obviously, as we just mentioned, plants create oxygen, which are great to have in ponds. However, you always have to remember that some of that will get removed during the nighttime. So make sure you have an alternative source of oxygen, either through a waterfall that's running all the time or an aerator. And yes, tasty snacks. Some fish will try to snack on your plants. It is highly dependent on the species in your tank or pond and the individual fish in the system. Some fish, mostly these guys, will destroy plants out of sheer boredom. Well, at least we can't find any other reason for them to actually go and do that. Anytime there's a plant, they love jumping on it. And again, this can happen a lot during spawning season. So outdoor fish in ponds coming into season, usually around the springtime, they're going to want to have some place for their eggs to land. And a lot of koi prefer having some sort of plant material in there, or those big bristly spawning brushes, because the eggs will adhere to either the roots of the plants or the bristles of the brush and kind of give those eggs a nice safe place to hatch. And then when the fry are a little bit bigger, they'll be able to kind of hide in those roots without getting eaten by their bigger friends. However, if it's not spawning season and your fish are still kind of trying to nibble your plants to death, it's always important that you go ahead and evaluate your diet, because you want to make sure that you're giving them enough food so they don't feel they have to try to nibble all your plants. And is it the right diet for the species? Especially with some indoor aquarium plants. Some different species like are more herbivorous and like having a little bit of plant to munch on, and perhaps just feeding them a kind of omnivore, more carnivorous pellet, they're going to go make sure they get all their greens. So switching them to a more herbivorous pellet will make sure that they get everything that they need to eat. Now, again, with these koi and these plants, any kind of plants, we commonly hear this phrase that I don't need to feed my koi because they'll eat the algae. Yes, green poop is coming out of them, but I'm sorry to say that this is completely wrong. Koi are omnivores, not herbivores. They are actually eating the bugs out of the algae. They have no consideration for the green stuff unless, I don't know, they feel like flossing with it. It is best to feed your koi a complete pelleted diet year round. You can let them nibble the algae. Again, I guarantee they are only eating the bugs out of it. Koi and their common carp ancestors are primarily bug eaters. They're omnivores. They want a little bit of meat, a little bit of veggie. Bugs are perfect and crunchy and delicious. So if you say this to me, I'm going to give you an eye roll and continue on with our talk. So now we're going to go through some of the common aquatic plant questions that we get asked. Starting with the one we already started with, can I have fish and plants together? Well, hopefully, if you haven't been asleep for the last 17 minutes, you'll understand, yes, you can absolutely have fish and plants together. Plants can be a great addition to the aquatic environment. They'll give oxygen, they provide enrichment, give your fish something to swim through and look at. If you want to start some spawning behaviors, it's great to have give those eggs someplace to hold on to. However, you will need to do some additional maintenance in order to make sure that those plants are not harming your environment and indeed mostly benefiting your fish. So starting off, what maintenance do plants require? If you are in an area that gets into the freezing temperatures over the winter or even in the mid to low 40s, you may want to overwinter them in a warmer greenhouse. You can even do it inside. Make sure that you either bring some fish with them inside, or if you have fish already inside, you can use that water again. And you want to make sure, or you can use commercial fertilizers. It's always important that if you have plants in your pond that you remove dead leaves as soon as you notice them. This is a lovely dead lily leaf here. A lot of them were turned yellow when they start to go bad. But it's very important that you take those out because, again, that's not going to be providing any oxygen. That's going to be returning more ammonia into your system. So again, if you're able to take it out when it just turns a little bit yellow and starts to look just a little bit bad, you'll actually be saving yourself a lot as far as water changes go. Thick root bulbs, again, depending on what species of plant you have, may need to be repotted every few years. Yes, some of these can grow to giant monstrosities of a plant. And you want to make sure that you can get them out and repot them every few years. If you have plants that have been in, say, your pond for a really long time, we're talking at least 4 or 5 years, completely undisturbed. It's just a massive mat of roots and dirt, all that great stuff. Before you go hacking that into smaller pots, make sure to take it out of your pond. Again, we talked about this in our water quality lecture. Big rooted up organic materials that aren't getting any oxygen, especially if it's really wedged in there, can start to create anaerobic bacteria that are going to produce hydrogen sulfides. And hydrogen sulfides, if they get into your pond water, can kill your fish. So if you're going to be doing any serious plant trimming and they haven't been trimmed in a really long time, take them out before you start mucking around in there. If your pot itself is buried down in the substrate or those roots are just in there really, really big and dense, evacuate the fish before you regret it. We have had lots of people clean out bogs and all these great filters, and then their fish start to get sickly and start to die. Well, unfortunately, you'll really know it by that rotting egg smell. That is that sulfide. But make sure that when you're doing any sort of big cleaning job you haven't touched in a couple years, get the fish out of harm's way first. And plants will require different water flows depending, on their species. So some plants will like very high area of water flow. Some like more boggy conditions where there's not very minimal water flow. So you may have to experiment with plants around your system to find a good spot for them. Is there any way to avoid algae? Well, we're including algae in here just because it is mistaken as a plant most of the time. Unfortunately, fish produce a nitrate from their metabolism, and algae uses nitrate for growth. So I'm sorry to say that if you have fish, you will have algae unless you are really on top of your water changes and you're keeping that nitrate from actually getting to grow with that algae. But unfortunately, I don't think I've seen a pond yet, or a tank for that matter, that didn't have just a little bit of algae in it. However, there are some things you can do to help that. Safest for fish are going to be a UV light. So this is a light that sits in a little glass tube, usually plumbed into your system somehow, needs to be replaced every year, and will zap those tiny little cellular algae as they're floating by. This is best for that pea soup algae, which is on top up there. Basically, it's cellular and turns your pond a lovely pea soup green. However, once you put the UV light on, you are going to be having a gray pond. Because once all those little algae cells die, they're going to be sent out into suspension and basically just change the color of your pond from green to gray. You'll need a very fine mesh or sieve filter in order to remove this kind of dead algae from your system. UV lights do absolutely nothing to protect your fish against bacteria, parasites, fungi, viruses, anything like that. It is only going to treat the water that passes through it. Unless you have a very tiny fish getting through there somehow, I don't think they're even going to survive being sterilized at that size. But UV lights are only going to treat your cellular algae. That's the only thing they're on that system for. Another common additive is barley, straw, and extract. This actually works best as a preventative against the stringy algae on the bottom picture there. Basically keeps those little strings from forming by keeping the individual cells from sticking to each other. There are different formulations. You can get it as an extract. Basically take your barley, put it in a blender, and let it do its thing for a little while. Yes, you can entirely make it yourself if you're interested. They make the pelleted from the big bales. Basically, this will be cut down and break down very quickly. Or it will be the straight up straw bale of barley like you get on a farm. The bales themselves will take a little while to start breaking down. You really need the extract to come out once it starts degrading in order to have it work correctly. So we like the extract. It's very readily available, and you can make it yourself, especially if you have one of those Bullet or Ninja blenders. You can obviously remove water through water changes to keep those nitrates from getting at your algae. Again, not many people consider this when they're doing their water changes. Or you can add plants to actually compete with the algae for those nitrates and phosphates if you have them. Again, we're talking about a single cell organism, the algae, versus a more complex plant organism. The algae, unfortunately, is going to win some of the time, but if you do have plants, it will lessen the amount of nitrates for that algae. So keep that in mind. However, there are some chemical additives, I don't have to say them, you know what they are, that are available. I really don't like recommending these considering there are many other options for people to use. Certainly if you have string algae, forgot to put on there that manual removal is going to be the easiest. However, it is the most labor intensive. Chemical additives, you really have to know the volume of your water. And many ponds that are not perfect rectangles, unfortunately, you don't know exactly the volume. And if you add too much of these chemical additives, it can very much hurt your fish. And there's some fish that are actually more susceptible to it than others. So it's very important that I would highly recommend that you try those safer algae combat techniques above before you just grab the bottle and pour a bunch in. So if you have specific ponds or tank specific questions, please go ahead and ask me in the questions. We can try to come up with an individual plan, but at least give those first ones a run before you start reaching for the nuke. If I have plants in my fish system, do I never have to do water changes? Well, I really, really wish this was yes, but unfortunately, no. So water changes, again, will remove 100% of the hormones and other products produced by fish. Plants only remove, again, those nitrates and those phosphates, maybe a few other minerals, but fish produce more than just waste, especially if you have spawning individuals. They will be producing hormones that, again, are fat-based and are not going to be taken up by plants. Plants don't really care about that. If you have a fish that is stressed or traumatized, they actually send out a signal in the water to tell all the other fish, hey man, something's up, be on your guard. So those stress hormones, again, will be floating around your system and will not be taken out by anything other than a water change. And of course, if you have plant materials that are just falling to the bottom and dying, your ammonia is really not going anywhere. Certainly, as the plants grow and get bigger, they will be using up all those nitrates. However, if you're letting all your plants just die back into your system, you'll be re-releasing all that ammonia. So it will do a considerable amount. However, you're really not going to get a large impact for a fish system unless you set up a different bog filter. And a bog filter is basically going to be a separated area of your pond, usually I want to say about 20 to 15% of your total pond volume that is solely plants. And these are plants that the fish cannot get into. And these are plants that are constantly being trimmed and removed. So essentially you're permanently removing that from the pond, but you need a large volume of plants to make a dent in any sort of hobbyist system. Again, this is going to vary on what kind of plants you have, what the temperature of your system is, what kind of fish you have in your system, and what is fed to your fish. Certainly, we highly encourage people to go ahead and try it yourself. We all have these great test kits available that you can go ahead and experiment. If you add maybe 3 plants, see what happens to your nitrates. If you have a big aquarium tank and you just want a big planted tank just full of plants, yes, absolutely, give it a try, see what happens. I'd really like you to keep doing a little bit of those water changes though, just to make sure all those other hormones get out. But you will not have to do as big of a change. Can plants carry fish disease? Yes, they absolutely can. So this is for plants that say you're purchasing from your friend, the dealer, that have been kept with other fish. Obviously, if the plants have been kept with just plants and have never seen a fish, they are not going to be carrying fish disease. However, again, plants, aquatic plants, usually need fish to survive. So a lot of these plants will be kept with fish at the wholesaler, at the dealer. Thankfully, it's a very easy question to call them up on the phone and ask and says, does your plant tank where you harvest your plants have fish in it? If they say yes, you're going to want to go ahead and quarantine all plants very similarly to fish. If you call them up and say, no, our plants are completely fish-free, you don't have to worry about them carrying fish disease. So if you are going to be quarantining your plants, we highly recommend you do not keep them with fish and use instead commercial fertilizers like these lovely little plant tabs over here. Without fish in their system, most of the bacterial parasite life cycles will be broken. So that's how we get away with doing this, and obviously it's going to be of shortened duration rather than those 4 to 6 weeks we talk about for most fish. This is going to be significantly shortened because we have a lack of a fish host. However, again, this will be temperature dependent like everything else we talk about. You can do a 3% hydrogen peroxide dip with the lovely hydrogen peroxide you get from the store. However, this is not a guarantee that you're going to get everything. Mycobacterium is one of the ones that you cannot get with hydrogen peroxide. So highly recommend that you're going to quarantine your plants, use some of these fertilizers to keep them alive, and then they will be safe to put in your fish system. What are the best plants for aquariums? Personally, I very much like Anacris, Amazon sword, and Anubias. All of these are relatively cheap and available at most aquatic pet stores that carry plants. They're very easy to set up. The Anacris sometimes comes as a little bunch. The sword and Anubias usually come in a little pot. And you can use planted soil if you like. However, a lot of these planted soils will actually decrease the pH of your system. So you want to make sure that you're having your fish kept at an appropriate pH as well. And what about ponds? So again, may need a container to deter the nibbling. We have our lovely lilies, and you can do the lotus as well. They're a little bit more expensive. The water lettuce, which you can see here is in a homemade little ring there to keep it from A, probably getting sucked down the skimmer, and B, from being nibbled on by the fish. And our lovely water hyacinth there in that floating topper there to keep it from being nibbled. There are a few branching out. If you have ever kept hyacinth in a very active warm summer pond, it replicates like crazy. So again, wherever you get your plants from, be they from an aquarium or a pond, make sure that you ask them if they're being kept with fish or not. So with that, that is everything that I have for aquarium plants. They're a lot of fun, and again, might need a little bit more maintenance just to keep all of those dead leaves from falling into your system and just re-releasing the ammonia. If you're interested in kind of experimenting a little bit, I'd love to hear how your experiments have gone, especially in a system that's already established. Your filters are already set up. It's nice, warm, plants are happy, fish are happy. Try it out, see what happens. There is absolutely no reason that you cannot have plants and fish in a system together, which was the whole point of doing this talk. All right, I will try to answer these questions. Again, I apologize. My box here is very, very tiny. So we have a question here about the fertilizers that we talked about before. The tabs, and there are liquid additives as well. So again, are they safe for fish? Excuse me. Most of them are very safe for fish. Again, you really need to make sure that you know exactly what your volume of water is. Certainly, if you have an established fish system, you're obviously not going to need too much of that fertilizer. Certainly, it might be able to put in a couple of different minerals if you have a particular plant that really needs one or two specifics. But again, just keep in mind that it really needs to know what the volume is, and that has to say that it is safe for fish. Some of these are not safe for fish, and certainly you can give them in a separate tank just for a short period of time if you are worried about them being difficult for your fish. Oh, good. Okay, so this one's a really long one. I think it's on quarantine. Has a system that... So this is a question about plants that are kept in fish systems, not in the same tank, but in the same system. So if the shared water is a problem. Absolutely, the one parasite I can think of is ick, and this is white spot disease. If you're not familiar with it, basically the parasite goes through an encysted stage that can float through the aquarium, the pond, and settle on something. And again, that could certainly be a plant. So even if it's in the same system, if the fish aren't right next to it, I can think of a couple examples where those plants could be infected by disease. Again, you're going to have to ask whatever wholesaler you have some more specifics about it. All right, one more question on algae. Okay, so I kind of glossed over this really quick, but for string algae, the best way to get over it and get that barley to really work well is to remove it manually. Yes, I know it's not the answer that you want to hear, but really getting in there with either a rake, your fingers, a comb, and pulling it out will be the best way to get it out of your system. And then when you start adding the barley on top of that, it acts as a preventative and keeps those cells from sticking to each other. Now you're going to have cells in suspension, which is where you get your UV light in there. So it's going to be kind of a three-pronged approach. But again, I'm really sorry, string algae, best method of removal that's very safe for fish. Get a rake, remove it by hand. Get your kids involved, throw them in and get them all nice and squishy. Does anyone else have any more questions about plants and fish? All right, well, all of our information is there. If you have any additional questions or topics, we are looking for topics for 2019 now. Please feel free to go ahead and reach out to us. Thank you so much for joining us today on plants and fish. I had a lot of fun writing this webinar and I learned a lot as well. So hopefully we get to see you next month for our fish and surgery talk, which will be very, very cool. So anyway, hope you all have a lovely day and we'll hopefully see you next month.